Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Along with Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech, and we're going to get into one of the big issues for the last couple of weeks, and it's all these Khalistan-related clashes taking place around the globe. We saw stuff happen in California, specifically in San Francisco, where there was actual, demonstrated violence towards the consulate in San Francisco, windows broken, a door broken into. We heard about injuries involving Consul General members in San Francisco. We were there on site to document some of these clashes. Also in the UK, in London, the Indian flag was pulled down by Khalistan supporters. That led to a whole ruckus as well. There was more peaceful demonstrations in Sydney, Australia, but again, a global movement, as Jonathan well knows about the power of social media. Folks got together, they collectively decided to push this out there, and they made an impact.
So how would you categorize the people who actually caused the damage and, essentially took over these consulates? Would you say they're criminals?
Well, the Khalistan movement is one that is complicated. You have folks going back to 1984, where you had violence related to the Golden Temple being raided because they were harboring folks that the Indian government.
What's so complicated about somebody destroying a consulate or invading?
Well, I mean, we're talking about also a 4-decade, 5-decade history.
So would you call them criminals or not?
I'm not calling anyone a criminal unless they actually get indicted and are, they're guilty by their peers. I'm sure you know that. You go to court every single day. But I will say, if you're vandalizing stuff,
it's
these people should be prosecuted.
It's a criminal act.
And so we're going to have Terry Milewski join us in just a moment to break this down. Terry Milewski, the foremost author about the Khalistan movement over the last 50 years. He's been breaking this down from Canada, but his book is called Blood for Blood, and we're going to have him join us in just a moment. But this issue is global in nature. And I think what's interesting, Jonathan, is that this started with Clubhouse in the last couple of years, this audio platform. Now, for those of you that use Twitter, it's called Twitter Spaces. They've kind of taken some of that tech. But you would have these private Clubhouse groups of people from around the world, primarily Sikh, that would talk about these kind of independent movements around the globe and how to coalesce this around the world. And these folks have made an impact. They are certainly.
Well, it's still not a big deal in the States. So until it really starts to become, somebody getting impacted, their own backyards and so on and so forth, and the local media starts to cover it and really gets into the issues, it really does become confined to these little spaces, like you said, the clubhouses or social media. And I'm not dismissing that. But again, if you ask the average American what's going on, who's a Khalistani? What? I mean, who? They don't know that. They have no clue what's going on. So that's really fascinating right now. You have these incidents of violence. You have these takeovers of consulates that you ask the average person on the street, they have no idea what's going on.
Well, that's true. And that's part of the reason we want to discuss it on the show. And we're going to have Terry Milewski join us in just a moment here to break this down. But just to point out one thing, the Indian government, which knows about this, they're taking this kind of a very gentle approach because, again, the Sikh community, by and large, in India, again, it depends on who you're hearing from. The Khalistan supporters will tell you, that the Sikhs, by and large, in Punjab are with their movement. And then you talk to the Indian government, they're saying, look at the election results, and a very small minority are looking for a separatist movement, a different government, a new nation, a very small minority, 1 or 2%. So this is the dichotomy. And so this is why India is so complicated with all these different faiths, all of these different folks with different backgrounds living all together. Joining us now to explain the Khalistan movement is none other than Terry Milewski, who's been a correspondent for CBC in Canada for more than 4 decades. He's written a book called Blood for Blood, really tracking the global Khalistan movement. Terry, I'm so pleased to finally sit down with you. To me, you're the foremost expert when it comes to the Khalistan movement, certainly in North America. Give our viewers and listeners some context about what you've uncovered over the course of your reporting for all these years.
I've uncovered a failure. I think, let's be blunt, this thing has been rolling for 50 years since they first took out an ad in the New York Times, 1971, in which a fellow named Chauhan declared himself the president of the new independent state of Khalistan, of which nobody had heard and which did not exist, and invited the world to recognize this new state. And since then, it has gone nowhere. Nevertheless, it has managed to make a tremendous amount of noise. Pakistan got involved because there had been a war in 1971 with India, in which Bangladesh, which was previously East Pakistan, was torn off. I won't get into the details, but suffice to say that it got complicated geostrategically because of the entry of Pakistan into the fray as a sort of backstop, big brother to the Khalistan independence movement, which was run by a minority of Sikhs, it must be said, out of the only Sikh majority state in India, about 27 million people now. 58% of the state is Sikh. The rest are Hindus and a few others. And a small minority of those Sikhs have always had this idea that we'd be better off with an independent state. Unfortunately, because of the violent tendencies of this small minority and the backstop that they had in Pakistan to provide them with weapons, training, and safe haven in a neighboring country so that they could pop across the border, create mayhem, come back into Pakistan, and be safe from arrest there, safe from Indian reprisals. Because of that, the movement quickly gained a reputation, a well-earned reputation for extreme violence. Eventually, a popular figure, a charismatic preacher named Bhindranwale, a religious fanatic Puritan, arose as a focus of a rallying point, if you will, for the Sikh separatists, so-called Khalistanis, Khalistan meaning literally land of the pure. So you get the drift that this was an idea of a religious Puritan, and that all came to a head in the early 80s. I'm abbreviating, of course, quite a lot. That all came to a head in the early 1980s when the Indian Army was sent in by then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi into the Sikhs' Golden Temple, their holiest shrine, in 1984, June. And Bhindranwale and a lot of his gunmen, most of his gunmen, he was surrounded by gunmen. He had turned the Golden Temple into an armed camp, basically, which challenged the government, took up arms against the government. They were heavily armed, and they were crushed by the Indian Army. This became a scandal for the Sikhs. Oh my God, they've attacked our holiest shrine. There were reprisals, and the Sikhs took their revenge very quickly in October of that year, in '84, by assassinating Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, who was walking to her office in the morning, and her two Sikh bodyguards gunned her down. That, in turn, led to anger, riots in the streets of Delhi and elsewhere around India, in which thousands of innocent Sikhs were mowed down, burned, raped, massacred. And they haven't gotten over it. It's a long time ago now, 1984, but they're not over it. And they have, in the diaspora, that is to say the Sikhs all over the world, in Germany, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and most significantly in Canada, where I live, where we've got well over 500,000 Sikhs now. They have kept the flame alive, the flame of the hope of independence, and they are now trying, although the insurgency, the armed insurgency, in which 20,000 people were killed. I mean, this dwarfs the Irish Troubles, which went on for 30 years, were no doubt extremely vicious, but I mean, this insurgency, the Sikh insurgency, killed something like 6 times as many people as the Irish Troubles in less than half the time. So there were a lot of bullets and bombs flying around, and your older viewers may recall the so-called Kanishka bombing, the bombing of Air India Flight 182 in 1985, which was, if you like, the low point in the terrorist warfare of the Khalistanis, which they blew up a passenger airplane off the coast of Ireland. So now they're trying to revive the movement, although it was crushed militarily back in 1993, more or less. It died out. They're trying to revive it in cyberspace and through a referendum on Sikh sovereignty. Sorry for the long answer, but that's it all jammed into a couple of minutes.
Sure. I mean, this is where, Terry, one of the reasons we wanted you to come and explain this to us, because, American journalists have not covered this story with any depth, right? We see a conflict recently in just the last few days. There was a conflict at a Sikh temple in Sacramento where two Sikh gentlemen had a clash inside the temple while there was a parade going on outside, but it's kind of isolated to that. But, some video was released in connection with that, and you saw Khalistan flags all over this Sikh Gurdwara. And obviously, I'm in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we have a huge Punjabi Sikh community. I'm Punjabi myself. Sikhs and Hindus have lived together in harmony for hundreds of years. And yet we are seeing a movement at a lot of Gurdwaras around California and other parts where there are folks that are trying to espouse this. And it makes it very difficult for political leaders to stand up to it because they all are looking for votes. I'm sure this dynamic played out in Canada. So can you go back in time? And again, Jonathan, you feel free to chime in, but that bombing, I feel like the Air India bombing did not get any kind of airtime. I mean, we know the impact of what 9/11 had in the United States. It was shocking, even to this day. If you spend any time in New York, anyone that was there who witnessed 9/11, the people there have not forgotten 9/11. But I feel as if people have completely forgotten the Air India bombing, which was a pretty stunning situation by its own regard.
You're right. It has been kind of shelved, and it was shelved at the time because it wasn't our problem. That was the prevailing point of view in Canada. The plane blew up off the coast of Ireland, and it was carrying Canadians of Indian descent, principally. It wasn't a bunch of white ladies from Toronto. And I'm not accusing the whole country of being racist, but let's face it, it might have looked a little different if it were not for the fact that many Canadians thought the people who got blown up were strangers. Very briefly, what happened was that the terrorists, the Khalistani terrorists, in an effort to strike back at the Indian army and against the Hindus writ large because of the riots following the assassination of Indira Gandhi, they set out to blow up two Air India jumbo jets on opposite sides of the world simultaneously by putting two bombs in suitcases on flights that were connecting with Air India, one going west through Tokyo and one going east through London, flying out of Vancouver, Toronto, London, and Vancouver, Tokyo, Mumbai. And 331 people were killed. One of the bombs blew up in flight. That was Flight 182 on its way to London. And the crime was never really solved, partly because of the indifference that you allude to, where the Canadians thought, well, it's an Indian plane, it's an Indian problem, most of the people are of Indian descent. And the then Prime Minister of Canada, in fact, Brian Mulroney, sent condolences to Rajiv Gandhi, then the Prime Minister of India, upon the loss of what were, in fact, once you took a look, mainly Canadian citizens. Why was he commiserating with the Indians over the loss of Canadians? Except they weren't somehow considered fully Canadian or not Canadian enough. So this is not something that Canadians today are very proud of. They know that, to put it bluntly, we screwed this one up big time. First, because we had the suspects under surveillance, if you can imagine this. We had them under surveillance for 3 months before the bombing. We were watching the key guy, a guy named Talvinder Parmar. The Canadian intelligence agents were wiretapping him and watching his house for months before the bombing, didn't figure out what was going on, even though they followed him to a test bombing 3 weeks before the real thing. And still didn't figure out what was going on. Didn't want to act. They weren't policemen gathering evidence. They were intelligence officers gathering intelligence. They weren't about getting prosecutions. Anyway, point of the story is that this disaster resounds to this day, partly because of that indifference, the failure to stop the bombing, and then the failure to deliver some measure of justice to the victims' families because we messed up the prosecution as well after the bombing. And mostly they got off, but Parmar slipped away, fled the country, and was killed by the police in Punjab in 1992. So the story still resonates today. I know many of the victims' families. We became friends over the years, and they still feel this pain as sharply as any New Yorker remembers 9/11, I assure you. But the world moved on. It wasn't Lockerbie, for example. That was, a lot of white people on that plane, and not quite as many people died, but it's still a big story in the United States, isn't it?
I went to Syracuse, Terry. It's the Remembrance Scholars. I think it's something like 35 scholarships given every year to honor all the Syracuse students that died in the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie bombing. So that's still remembered to this day. I remember it as an undergrad. So the fact that Air India, I don't know if there's any kind of memorials or any kind of remembrance.
Well, there are now. There are now, and I was sent to cover the bombing in 1985. That's why I got interested in this story. And many years after that, I was based in the United States, in Washington, and I was in the Middle East for a while. But I always kept coming back to this story because I remembered meeting the victims' families and the grace with which they bore their loss. And I thought they might have something to teach people in the West. And so I kept pursuing it, and it happened that I was based in Vancouver on Canada's West Coast when the trial finally happened many years later. Not until 2000 did a couple of guys go to trial. And as I say, the ringleader of the plot had already been killed in India by the police. And that trial also failed. Not guilty, not guilty. The evidence was messed up, and the witnesses were threatened and killed. Well, that'll do it. If you don't have the witness because the witness is dead, you're going to lose the case.
Look, Terry, let's bring it back to the States then, and as well as Canada. It's 2023 now, and, we're kind of focused on this niche audience of South Asians, Indian Americans, Pakistanis, Hindus, Muslims, Khalistanis, so we have the opportunity on this platform to discuss these topics. But I want to know, if you go down the street and ask somebody, do you know anyone who's Khalistani? Their response is, what? Huh? So it's not mainstream, is what I'm trying to get at. Why isn't it mainstream at this point, even after all of these years?
Well, because it is a hopeless cause. And it's currently doing no damage except to people's bandwidth. That is to say that they're very adept in cyberspace. They preach daily that all the atrocities, all the killings back in the day, in the heyday of the Sikh independence insurgency, they were all done by the other guys. They're all done by the Hindus. We didn't do anything, which is a complete ridiculous lie. Those 20,000 people, maybe much higher, and being conservative. Most of them were Sikhs, by the way, who wanted no part of this independence revolt, and to this day like living in India. All of this makes it a hopeless cause. And we are no closer today than Khalistan than we were back in the heyday of the armed insurgency throughout the decade of the 1980s and the early 90s. As I say, the movement was crushed in 93. But the real reason, I think that's the real reason why people don't know about Khalistan today. It's because it's an old story that died out years ago, and there's no real reason. There's no terrorism now. They're not blowing up planes now. What they're doing is basically having demonstrations. They're holding referenda in various locations around the world, most recently in Australia, where, again, you've seen streets filled with Khalistani yellow flags, people going down the street marching and saying, Khalistan Zindabad, long live Khalistan. You see tremendous activity in cyberspace, little memes and movies, and a great many lies about the history of these affairs. But for those who are indifferent or ignorant about the Khalistan movement, what can you tell them? Why would they be interested if there's no big bang going off? If there is no terrorism, if people are not dying, and it's just guys preaching, like this preacher Amritpal Singh, who most recently has been in the news for a face-off with the police in Punjab. He's currently on the run, as you know.
So what you're saying is they're really trying to wage an info war. This really has turned into an information war on their end. With that said, look, we already know you're arguably one of the foremost experts when it comes to this specific topic. At the same time, you're also one of the few who's really scrutinized and really looked at this, movement and what's happening here every step of the way. I want to know, have you personally been threatened? Have you had any death threats against you for your coverage and just your truth-telling?
Routinely. It started many years ago.
Who's threatening you?
Yes. Well, the Khalistanis are threatening me because the things I say about them, about their cause being hopeless, about the lies that they tell, they don't want heard. It's just that simple. And it started, in my case, quarter century ago. They were posting on, I don't think they had Facebook then, but on various chat groups when they started. They posted, well, it's time to find out where Milewski lives and put his head on a stick. It was fairly crude sort of stuff. Bullets are cheap, and it's Milewski's turn. That was back in the day. And nowadays, they keep at it, but it's a little bit more polished. A recent one, about a year ago, I guess, a young fellow, young militant in the UK, got on Twitter and said, well, in English, we call it Terry Milewski, but in Punjabi, we call it Lala Nagat Narain, which means nothing to you, right? Well, unless you're a Punjabi and you know who Lala Nagat Narain was, namely a famous politician, journalist, and editor who was murdered in 1981 for standing up against Bhindranwale, the patron saint of Khalistan and of the Sikhs of the time. So he sees a critic, me, and he thinks about murder. That's the first thing that comes. He doesn't want to enter into a debate. They don't want to mix it up over facts. They want to threaten and murder people, as they did the witnesses in the Air India trial. And that's not just an info war. That's tending to something more. And now you see it. I mean, what you have seen in Punjab, without people in the West paying much attention, was an armed insurrection. I mean, if that happens on Capitol Hill, yeah, that's a story, right? But not if it happens in Amritsar, where this fellow Amritpal Singh and a whole throng of heavily armed gunmen, he's taken up arms against the government. He's defied the legally constituted authorities, intimidated and attacked a police station in a suburb of Amritsar because they wanted to spring one of their gang who had been arrested. And the police caved in. I mean, they were overpowered. They caved in. So they got their guy out. Then after they had achieved their object and fled, then suddenly they call out the police to go catch the guy. And they failed. I think it's about 10 days now. They've failed to find him. And he's popped up on video defying the government, and he's the voice of the Sikhs, and he's Bhindranwale version 2.0. So all of this means that there's a strong possibility that more violence will occur, and that more people are going to be following this story than really wanted to.
I mean, that's what makes this story have many layers to it. And I know I saw some of your reporting with regard to one of the perpetrators, or at least one of the alleged conspirators of the Air India bombing, because he got back in the news in the last couple of years because he himself was assassinated recently.
Yes, highlighting, by the way, the strong and important connection between the Khalistanis and organized crime. This was a contract hit. So here was a guy, a wealthy businessman, a millionaire, who was basically the financier of the terrorist group which blew up Air India in 1985. The terrorist group was called the Baba Khalsa, and it was founded by Parmar, the gentleman who was killed by the police in Punjab in 1992. So Malik, that was his name, Rapudaman Singh Malik, the financier, he was writing checks $10,000 at a time back in 1985. That was real money, to support the Baba Khalsa, which used some of it, I believe, to plant bombs on Air India planes and kill all those 331 people, including 2 Japanese baggage handlers who were unfortunate enough to jostle the bomb as they moved it to an Air India flight in Tokyo, and it blew up on the ground. So the point is that that Malik was assassinated last July, I believe, middle of July. Drove to his office, just getting on in years, I guess 75, and he had begun in his later years, after he was acquitted at the Air India trial, he had begun to make nice with the Indian government. Well, that's very odd, because the Indian government has always been the snake whose head must be bitten off, and it's a fascist and genocidal government. This is the basis of all the Khalistani propaganda, that Sikhs in Punjab are oppressed, repressed, massacred, the victims of an ongoing genocide. I'm quoting their leadership. They say there's an ongoing genocide, which you may find very odd, because the millions of Sikhs who still live in Punjab and have no interest in Khalistan don't seem to have noticed this ongoing genocide happening. Well, it isn't happening. It's a myth. And so this is what they're playing at. But Malik, the wealthy businessman who financed the group which blew up Air India, was assassinated as he sat in his car on his way to his office in Surrey, British Columbia, a pleasant suburb of Vancouver, and it's an important city in British Columbia. And you have to wonder, why was that? And as I say, it's probably because, this is speculation, I can't prove this, it's probably because he began to be very friendly with the government of Narendra Modi in New Delhi. How come? Well, he says, he wrote him a sugary letter saying, Prime Minister Modi, I want to congratulate you on the wonderful things you've done for the Sikhs, and you opened doors for the Sikhs, you're a great man, blah, blah, blah. So this must have been a shot across the bow of his colleagues in the movement, who must have thought, whoa, if he's going to say that to our arch enemy, the government of India, the monster Modi who we're accusing of genocide, he's going to rat out the rest of us. He's got to be silenced. And he was.
So, Terry, these Khalistani extremists, to the rest of the free world, are they still a legitimate threat? And especially here in the States, should the diaspora, especially Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Hindus, Muslims, should they be concerned about what's happening right now here in 2023? Why should they be concerned?
The answer is yes, they should be concerned. And I'll tell you briefly why. Think about this for a second. Khalistan, although it does not exist, has a powerful nuclear-armed friend, Pakistan. Pakistan, as you well know, has been at daggers drawn, arch enemies with India since the time of partition in 1947. Don't get me started on that. And Pakistan, as I said earlier, has always provided a safe haven, a refuge, a training ground, a source of weapons training and the like for the Khalistani militants. But Pakistan is also becoming rapidly a wholly owned subsidiary of China. It's massively indebted to China. Again, this is something that most Americans don't think about today, but one day soon they may have to think about it, because China, who they already think about a great deal, basically owns Pakistan, which cannot afford to pay back the tens of billions of dollars that China has invested in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is a part of which deeply involves Pakistan. So we're not talking about some ragtag mob of malcontents running around Punjab who never get on the front page, because why would Americans care? That's your question. Why should they care? Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've given you one hint why they should care. Second of all, inasmuch as they have a very powerful ally in Pakistan, which has shown its willingness to quote their national strategy, bleed India, administer the death of 1,000 cuts, to get their revenge on India for the war of 1971, which was so humiliating for Pakistan, blah, blah, blah. if that's the case, what about the Indian government? Well, the Indian government, they have some problems too. They're not as cozy with the West as the West would like. You can see a geopolitical picture emerging where, oh, that's interesting. Kashmir. India's grip in Kashmir is not exactly as solid as the Indians would like. Imagine that the Pakistanis would be able to engineer an independent state between mainland India and the territory of Kashmir by creating Khalistan and denying the Indian government its land access to Kashmir. Now you have what is called something called a K2 strategy, where there's an alliance between jihadists, Islamic militants in Pakistan and elsewhere, and conveniently Khalistani militants based in Punjab. You can see that if you start to think about the big picture geopolitically in the north of India, then it's a potentially very threatening environment. As I say, we're not at bombs going off, but remember that there is a war going on. Another thing that Americans don't pay much attention, nor do Canadians, there is a war going on in northern India, on the Chinese border, in the Himalayas. There are skirmishes regularly. It hasn't come to. They don't shoot at each other. They aim rocks at each other. They hit each other with sticks, because otherwise it would be a violation of the modus operandi that they have. But there is a war going on, a border war between China is building little towns and villages on what India considers its territory. This isn't going to end well. Now you mix in these other additives, and it's easy to see that you could have an explosive mixture. So that's one thing. The only other thing I will add directly on your question is that India's other problem is itself. Its present government is, how shall we say, not the greatest friend to democracy that the world could expect. The government of Narendra Modi has passed legislation governing the fate of Muslims in India, to some extent making them second-class citizens. If they're to be citizens at all, other people get an easy chance to get a citizenship, but not if you're Muslim. And the government has also been playing fast and loose with the judiciary and with the media. You've seen, for example, the leader of the opposition in India, Rahul Gandhi, has basically been kicked out of the parliament because he said a mean thing about Narendra Modi. Really? I thought that sort of thing only happened in Russia. No, now happens in India too. So we have a volatile mixture of a state in India, which is very soon going to be the most populous state in the world. It will eclipse China soon enough, if it hasn't already. I mean, who knows? They don't count accurately necessarily. So you have a state that is pushing the envelope, the democratic envelope, if you will, and provoking people in some cases to violence. And you also have this volatile, explosive situation on the northern border. Very soon, you might wish that you had looked into the Khalistan problem sooner.
I mean, certainly, Terry, the freedom of speech mechanisms in India are far different than we have in the United States. I mean, we're fortunate to even have this conversation. At the same time, I think what we've noticed here is that if you bring this subject up to political leaders, of which now there are 5 Indian Americans in Congress in the United States, including a couple here in California where I'm at, you bring this up to them directly, they hem and haw and dance around it. They don't want to, destroy a constituency or at least offend a constituency. And this is also true of the Indian diplomats who I have interacted with for many years. Very nice, genteel people. They don't want to say a syllable out of pocket. They don't want to harm sentiments, to use kind of their vernacular.
Yes,
they don't want to offend the Sikh community because it is an important constituency in India. And going back to what you're talking about, the political dynamic in Punjab, I mean, there is a political party in Punjab that is advocating for a separate nation, right? This Khalistan nation, and they get less than 1% of the vote, at least according to the last last time I checked the numbers. So
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is no
The
mass
last election,
call
they
for
got
Khalistan in Punjab.
2.5. Yeah, they got 2.5% of the vote in last year's election, and the one before that they got 0.3%, a fraction of 1% of the vote. So you're right; they have very, very little support inside Punjab. It's in the diaspora that there's a problem. But you're also right about freedom of speech. As an Indian friend explained to me, in India, freedom of speech, it's not a thing. And you know that to be true. They dance around it, as you say. It's not sacrosanct the way it is certainly in the United States or Canada. And they're only going to crack down harder, I think, in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Rahul Gandhi situation is very complicated in its own realm because he's got to play by those rules, whatever those rules are, even though he's obviously a political icon. His family is a dynastic group. And so that's a different dichotomy. Obviously, we all generally, I think what's happened here also, Terry, is that journalists are towing the line as well. And so are the political leaders in the United States. They are not speaking out about these different movements because a lot of these folks, and again, in California, we have folks that are of Sikh origin that donate heavily to the different political parties out here. Certainly the Democratic Party in California, it gets a lot of funding from the Sikh community, some of whom support the Khalistan movement, some of whom don't, but they're very influential in Sacramento. And so I've seen the governor of California attend some of these events. I've seen all kinds of political leaders, and thus this situation does not get played up. In fact, I was talking to one of my sources when the San Francisco consulate got vandalized, who told me, the United States government, we have a global treaty with the U.S. You're supposed to take care of our embassies, our consulates, just like we take care of yours in India. So I think some of the Indian officials were very offended at what happened in San Francisco, certainly what happened in the UK, and they even retaliated a little bit by pulling some of the security in front of the UK embassy in India briefly. So
yes,
this is a very complicated story, Terry.
Yeah, and this is an important part of the story. And I'm glad you brought it up because and in Canada, we're kind of the leading indicator in this because we've had numerous Sikh members of the federal cabinet, both under Liberals and Conservatives. In fact, Liberals, Conservatives, and the left-wing party, all of them have been playing footsie with Khalistanis for years now in return for vote. It's vote bank politics, well understood in India and in the United States, of course, whereby politicians like the votes, and so they go to the annual Vaisakhi parade at the local Gurdwara, and they smile and wave as the floats go by in the parade, carrying, more often than not, posters of famous Sikh Khalistani martyrs, gun-toting assassins, even including characters like Talvinder Parmar, the mastermind of the Air India bombing, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, pictured as a holy man, a martyr, a shaheed, and a model for Sikh youth. And so these politicians see these parades go by, and they go every year, and they smile and wave. And you say, what are you doing? I mean, if they had a parade for Osama bin Laden, would you be there smiling and waving? I mean, what are you doing here? And they say, well, I didn't see anything untoward. I didn't know. They're just, guy pictures. And, then they suddenly remember an urgent appointment that they have to run to. So they dance around this issue, and sometimes it's not very pretty. And there have been cases, in Canada, for example, we've had 4 cases of graffiti, Khalistani graffiti, being spray painted onto Hindu temples in and around Toronto. We've had 4 cases, I think, in about 7 or 8 months recently. So you can say, well, that's not really violence. They haven't gone over the edge yet. Well, I have friends in Toronto that have been beaten severely. I've had friends in Vancouver, well, one in particular, who was murdered because he was a witness in the Air India trial, as I alluded to earlier. Dead men tell no tales. So the political element here, by entering into mainstream politics and being very astute about it and telling politicians, look, I can deliver 10,000 votes in this constituency, in this district. But if you don't sing my song, if you don't smile and wave at my Vaisakhi parade and say nothing about the martyrs, well, we might take our votes elsewhere. The politician says, no, don't do that. I'm with you. And that's how it's working now.
I mean, we see that here in the United States, but I think there's another dynamic here where are they going to go, if these guys are aligned with the Liberal Party, are they going to start voting for the Conservatives? I don't see that happening, right? I mean, you see that, again, like we have these bulk voting groups in the United States, the Black community, Hispanics, now even more granularly, like the Muslim community, the Sikh community. Are they going to vote for folks that may not even have their interests aligned? That to me is, I think the politicians are not doing enough math about, okay, look, what do I stand for? If you just stand for collecting cash from everybody, that's one thing. But if you stand for, you have certain principles, then maybe you need to stand for them.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, but this is an important point, both in Canada and the United States and in the other democracies, UK notably, but Germany, Italy, and now Australia as well. It's an important point that people, because they're trading on our ignorance, because as we've already agreed, there's so little attention to this problem. People don't understand it. I mean, okay, there's some local squabble going on. We don't know how to say their names. They're far away in another part of the world. And we don't really know, and we don't really care to know who's right and who's wrong. It's too complicated. We've got other issues to think about. And because of that, the most energetic, the most calculating, and in some cases the most deceptive, win the day. They're the ones who end up with political power. And sometimes it blows up in their faces, but at the moment, that's the way it's been going. And I must say that although in most of those countries, Hindus are the majority among the Indian diaspora around the world, they're not particularly active politically. They also look the other way. They let it happen.
I mean, Terry, remind us again, how this issue, this area of focus really became, your passion, really. I mean, I think a lot of the coverage out there, what we know about this movement is because of what you've done up to this point. And who else is taking up who are you passing the baton on to at this point, right? I mean, how many other Western journalists are out there covering this important beat?
Well, there are a few, although we're getting old. There are a few, and there are a few now. I'm talking developing in the last couple of years only. A younger cohort, much more energetic than guys like me, much more adept at social media. A friend of mine in New York, Puneet Sahani, put up a clip of an interview with a separatist leader in Punjab yesterday. Boom, 167,000 views on Twitter. Wow. And this in the space of a few hours. I mean, he only put it up last night, and it's taken off like a rocket because there's an attempt to push back. And it's not just me or me and a couple of other guys. And a colleague of mine, Kim Boland, in Vancouver. And really, you could name on one hand, the fingers of one hand, the people who really exercised about this story. But that's changing a bit now because of the salience of stories like this recent one with Amritpal Singh. Armed men crash and invade and intimidate a police station. That's a dramatic story. He gets away in a Mercedes like the Scarlet Pimpernel. He's in flight, and the police, 80,000 police, haven't caught him yet. It's an exciting story. I've had a lot of calls from Indian outlets in the past 10 days since that happened. So, story like that happens. It gets to be in everyone's imagination. And I don't think that story is by any means over. But there is a new generation who is pushing back, and we've discussed the fact already that in Punjab, the masses of millions of Sikhs have no interest in Khalistan, but they do have interest in some armed, a private militia. Can you imagine this in California? A private militia invades a police station to spring one of their gang, and the police cave in and they get away with it, drive off in a Mercedes and can't be found.
Well, aside from the Mercedes, it sounds like what happened here in Seattle when a bunch of Antifa took over the East Precinct during the Chop Chaz BLM protest back in 2020. So it did happen in America here in Seattle, Washington, where I'm based. But all joking aside, Terry, I got to ask you as well, kind of finally for me, just, the entire state of our industry, journalism. Back in the day, it was advertisers supporting newspapers, and then the TV folks, they were the stars and in their own world, but they relied heavily on newspapers. But now newspapers are collapsing all over the world. We're seeing more conglomerates take over, more consolidation, and good journalists, the veterans with institutional knowledge, are leaving or quitting the industry entirely. Are you seeing that as well on your end, and how has that impacted ultimately this area of focus?
Well, they haven't gone entirely. I differ with you there, because an awful lot of them are on Substack. They've found other outlets.
Media now, other outlets, other platforms, social media.
Yeah. They're on social media, and that's where the action is now. I used to work for the CBC. It's a bit of a constitutionally set up kind of like NPR or PBS in the States, except that we're both NPR and PBS, and we're radio and TV. It's by far the CBC is by far the largest news organization in Canada. But its ratings are down like everybody else's. Nobody's waiting for the good evening. It's the evening news, and now we're going to tell and you're supposed to wait for it. I mean, you already know it. You read Twitter on the bus home. Right. You already know the news, and if there's anything breaking, it'll be on Twitter before it's on the evening news isn't on the it's a half-hour program, 22 minutes after commercials. So it's because the old media is becoming irrelevant. Guys like me are becoming irrelevant, and the future belongs to people who are quick with their fingers and can establish a reputation for reliable journalism, which is a big if. Right now, you've got characters like Elon Musk saying, "Oh, well, we must have more citizen journalism, and citizen journalism is going to be much better than these legacy media. They're all corrupt and they're hacks and so forth," which is absolute nonsense. The New York Times on any day, or the Washington Post on any day, is 10 times more accurate than what you read on Twitter, let's face it, by citizen journalists. What, the Malibu Observer, was it, that Musk retweeted? Well, never mind. Let's not beat up on.
Well, in fairness, the Washington Post and the New York Times aren't perfect either, so they've had their fair share of missteps along the way that have been exposed on social media. And if it wasn't for the alternative voices now pushing back and adding to the narrative and this other worldview and perspective, I don't think that we would have been able to call them out. But I do agree with you 100%. I feel like we need journalism to be alive and well and strong. We need legacy media to continue to do well, but we also need the independents and the citizen journalists as well to rise up. And these types of platforms, the reason why we're talking to you, Terry, we need to make sure that guys like you are not forgotten, and we should, be, thanking you for all the work that you've done up to this point, so, we can carry the torch, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I will contradict myself as well. But I mentioned a moment ago the fact that my friend Puneet Sahani on Twitter posted this little video of an important Khalistani politician yesterday, and boom, suddenly he's got, he's on his way to 200,000 views now. Why? First, he's accurate, and he's got a reputation for being accurate and citing sources and facts. Nobody's upset him on facts yet, so he's got a future. Second, what is the content? Well, that's very interesting. The guy we're talking about is a guy called Simranjit Singh Mann, who has for many years been the head of a splinter group of a Sikh political party in Punjab. That splinter group is devoted to the idea of an independent state of Khalistan. It's not violent, so they don't preach armed insurgency, and he's allowed to run candidates in Punjabi elections, and those are the votes which we've already derided as microscopic really, with the 2.5% in the last election, 0.3% in the one before that, 0 seats in the Punjabi legislature, although man has a federal seat himself at the moment. The point is, what's going on there? Well, the reason this video got so many views when posted by some no-name citizen journalist in New York, who happens to be a Punjabi, was because in that video, man confesses, blithely admits, that he sold letters of reference to get visas so that immigrants from Punjab could get asylum in the West. He would sell them a reference letter. You give me 50,000 rupees, and I will give you a letter saying you're a persecuted member of my political party and you need political asylum. And it's worked. He said 50,000 satisfied customers so far. So he's raised, if the numbers are right, maybe $20 million for his party. This is a large-scale scam and a very successful one. So this is why, in this particular case, a citizen journalist with a bright future who relies on facts and produces the evidence in the form of videotape, which you can see for yourself, in which man himself confesses this. Well, maybe we won't need the New York Times and the Washington Post if there are more of these guys doing a job like that.
Video don't lie, Terry. Video don't lie.
No, and I'm so glad you brought this up, Terry, because the asylum issue is a significant one, and I know this much, being Punjabi myself, associating with Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims and this whole diaspora. There are a lot of folks that I know in California that have come here via asylum, and of course, most people will walk around. They did it legitimately, but there's no question there's other folks that are kind of rubber stamping the visa issue, and we have this huge green card backlog in the United States, and a lot of folks use the asylum route to get to the States.
And they depend very much upon maintaining this myth that in India, Sikhs are oppressed and the victims of, again, this ongoing genocide, which nobody else knows about because it's not real.
And I give you a lot of credit, Terry, for distilling all this information. It's a very complicated subject. Obviously, there was graphic violence in 1984 that's undeniable, and a lot of folks did flee and had to find another way to make a living and protect their families, and so here we are with all of these things going on. And I'm so pleased that you were able to break this down for us, and we'd love to have you back on as this story continues to evolve, because certainly this is not the end of it, that's for sure.
Yeah, it could get big soon, so keep your eye on it.
We will. Terry Milewski, formerly of CBC, and of course he's an author of the book Blood for Blood. Thank you so much. Check out his writings, really insightful. And of course, you can follow him on Twitter.
I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thanks again,
a lot, Terry. Now we're going to turn to our AAPI hate segment presented by the California Public Library. Another real tragic situation. A 15-year-old boy in San Francisco was stabbed on a bus. And the worst part, Jonathan, the suspect is 12 years old.
Yeah, I mean, these situations are just happening over and over again, and the suspects and the perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators, are younger and younger. We're seeing it in all these videos online, just young people, it's a free-for-all. And I have no doubt that social media is playing a role in all of this as well. I mean, when they're seeing these incidents of Asians being beat up and attacked and targeted, they're copycats that go out there as well. It's open season on Asian Americans. There's no doubt, and it's a shame that this alleged suspect is only 12 years old, and I'm hoping that this can be sorted out. But my goodness, this is ongoing, and we really need to focus on why this keeps on happening.
And I just want to point out, the 12-year-old, apparently this is his second incident where he's done something along these lines. He is in custody, and it's stunning that I hope this poor young man gets assistance. The 15-year-old was almost mortally wounded. I mean, the 12-year-old hit an artery. So it's a terrible story. And again, this is happening in my hometown.
So has this been deemed a hate crime?
Not yet. But I think the schools have been not as responsive as some parents would like, and that's why I wanted to bring this up, because again, we don't know
the ethnicity yet of the perpetrator. Is that right?
That's another aspect, right? That has not also been disclosed. I haven't seen any paperwork on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I mean that again, it's really disappointing that this continues to be. I understand it's a delicate topic and an issue,
And
and we don't want to.
These are juveniles. So.
Yeah, well, exactly. But especially even with adults, we don't want to perpetuate, ongoing stereotypes and just again add to the flames. But this is just unbelievable. The community deserves to know, and this young man, especially the victim, needs help, needs to recover, hopefully. But this young man, this 12-year-old, my goodness, I'm just stunned. I'm speechless hearing that. It's 12 years old. It's a child who's doing this.
Stunning. All right, we're going to wrap this up by congratulating the Sacramento Kings owner, Vivek Ranadive. He finally made the playoffs. He's had the team for about a decade. The Kings made the playoffs. Congrats to him. Our thanks to Terry Milewski for joining us from formerly of the CBC. Check out his book. For Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We'll see you again next time.